The night Dottie Crane found out that Rocco Barretti had torn apart 3 city blocks on the south side of Chicago looking for her, she was standing at the prep counter of a small diner in Duluth, Minnesota, rolling out pie crust in the dark. It was Loretta who told her, Loretta who was still back there, still moving quietly through the Barretti household like a ghost in sensible shoes, texting from a burner phone she kept hidden in her apron pocket. He burned the Petrov boys' warehouse. They didn't have you. He knows they didn't have you. He doesn't care. He's burning things anyway. Dottie read the message twice, then set the phone face down on the counter and pressed her palms back into the cold dough. She thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. How a man who once told her she was furniture could somehow manage to burn a city, trying to find a piece of furniture he'd thrown away. That was the thing about Rocco Barretti. He didn't handle loss well. Dottie grew up in Rockford, Illinois, not the good part. The part with the check-cashing places and the liquor store with the bulletproof glass on the counter. Her mother died when Dottie was 19, leaving behind a house with a leaky roof, a beat-up Pontiac, and a father named Earl who spent most of his time at the track. Earl Crane was not a man built for restraint, which was how, by the time Dottie was 24, he'd managed to borrow $340,000 from the Barretti organization through a series of increasingly desperate and increasingly stupid middlemen, and paid back precisely none of it. Rocco Barretti ran the South Side with the kind of quiet efficiency that most legitimate businesses could only dream about. He was 43, wide-shouldered, with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes the color of old concrete. He hadn't personally threatened Earl Crane. Men like Rocco didn't make phone calls. They sent Vance, his underboss, shorter, less polished, with a way of sitting across from you at your own kitchen table that made you feel like the furniture. Vance came to the Crane house on a Thursday. Dottie was there because she'd driven over to drop off Earl's blood pressure medication, which he kept forgetting to pick up himself. She'd been working double shifts at the Hartwell Hotel downtown, housekeeping, 7 floors, 112 rooms, and she was tired down to her bones. She was wearing her uniform and had her hair pinned back, and she knew, like exactly what she was. A 24-year-old woman who worked very hard and had very little to show for it. Vance explained the situation with the particular politeness that only men with violent options can afford. The debt had grown considerably with interest. The organization was prepared to consider it settled, fully, permanently, never spoken of again, in exchange for something non-monetary. What? Dottie had asked, because Earl wasn't saying anything, just staring at the tabletop. Mr. Barretti, Vance said, folding his hands, is in the middle of a federal investigation into his business interests. His legal team believes that a married man, a settled man, a man with a household, presents a different profile to a jury. He is looking for a wife, someone quiet, someone who understands discretion. Someone he doesn't have to worry about, Dottie said. Vance almost smiled. That's one way to put it. She married Rocco Barretti 6 weeks later in a civil ceremony with 8 witnesses, none of whom were her friends. He wore a charcoal suit and shook the officiant's hand afterward like it was a business deal, which, of course, it was. There was a night, early on, maybe the 3rd month, when she'd found him reading in the kitchen at midnight, and he'd looked up and said, "Can't sleep either." And she'd said no, and he'd nodded toward the other chair, and they'd sat for an hour, not talking much. Just the two of them and the refrigerator hum, and she'd thought, maybe. She'd let herself think maybe for that 1 hour. She counted it, later, because she wanted to be honest with herself about how many chances she'd given him. She counted 1. For 2 years, Dottie lived in the Barretti house on Westover Drive, like a very expensive piece of furniture. That was what he'd eventually call her, but she'd figured it out on her own long before he said it out loud. She managed the household staff, handled the calendar, made sure the right flowers were on the table when Rocco hosted dinners, and disappeared into the background the moment real business started. She ate alone in the kitchen more nights than not. She read paperbacks and tended a small container garden on the back terrace. She kept her own bedroom clean and spare, with a lock on the door she used every single night. Rocco didn't mistreat her the way some men mistreat women they don't love. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grab her arm. He simply, and this was somehow worse, didn't see her. She was part of the infrastructure of his life, like the HVAC system or the water softener, functional, invisible, not worth remarking on. He kept a woman named Priya, sharp-featured, always in heels, the kind of thin that looks expensive, who came to the house for dinners and events with the comfort of someone who knew exactly how little the wife upstairs mattered. The night things broke was in late March. Rocco was hosting a dinner for 4 of his captains and their wives, a rare social occasion where Dottie was actually expected to be present, to sit at the table, to demonstrate that the Barretti household was a picture of stability. She'd worn a burgundy dress she'd had altered 3 times to get right. She'd done her hair carefully. She had stood in the bathroom mirror for 20 minutes and felt, despite everything, like she looked nice. Priya was not supposed to be there. Priya showed up anyway. She arrived with a bottle of Brunello and a smile designed for rooms she wanted to own, and she sat herself down at the far end of the table, across from Dottie, as if she'd always had a seat there. One of the captain's wives made polite conversation about the centerpiece. Dottie managed the wine service, and kept her expression pleasant and said nothing. Then the food came, and Priya looked across at Dottie's plate, let her eyes travel the full length of her, and said, loud enough for the table to hear, "Rocco, honey, does she eat like this at every meal? I'm worried she's going to outgrow the chairs." The table went very still. Dottie set down her fork. She looked at Rocco. He was at the head of the table, swirling his wine, and for one single terrible moment she genuinely believed, he was going to say something, that the fact of her name being attached to his, that 2 years of running his household without complaint or request, would mean something in this moment. Instead he said, "Priya, that's enough," in exactly the tone he used when the dog knocked over a water bowl. Mild, reflexive, not angry, and then he picked up his fork and went back to his food, as if Dottie wasn't sitting there, as if it was already over. She found him in his study after everyone left. He was at his desk, jacket off, going through papers, and he didn't look up when she came in. "I want to know," Dottie said, "why you let her do that?" Priya's complicated, still not looking up. "I'm your wife." "You're a contract." He said it, the way you correct a spelling error, simple, flat. He finally glanced up. "Dottie, we both know what this is. You keep the house running, the feds see a stable household, your father stays healthy. That's the arrangement. Don't come in here expecting something it was never designed to give you." "I'm a person, Rocco." He leaned back and looked at her the way a man looks at a street he drives every day. Familiar, unremarkable, not worth a full thought. "Your furniture," he said. "Good furniture, solid, well placed. But I don't sit in you, and I'm not going to. You fill a space I need filled, that's it. You are not my partner. You are not my confidant. You are not," he paused, and when he finished, his voice was almost gentle, which was the worst version of it, "anything more than what you were brought here to be." Dottie didn't cry. The tears simply refused to come. What she found instead, standing in that study with the smell of leather and cigarettes and a man who'd just reduced her to a noun, was something that felt like a door closing very quietly from the inside. "Okay, Rocco," she said, and she walked out. He probably thought that meant she accepted it. Here is what Rocco Barretti did not know about the woman he'd installed in his house. She was observant in the way that people who have always been overlooked learn to be. She'd been a housekeeper for 3 years before Vance sat down at her father's kitchen table, and housekeeping teaches you to see a room the way most people never bother to, where things are actually kept, not where they're supposed to be kept. She'd cleaned the Barretti house for 2 years. In that time, she'd memorized the code to the safe behind the Rothko print in the study. She'd seen Rocco enter it twice while she was straightening the bookshelves, and she had the kind of memory for number sequences she'd never found a use for until now. She knew the folder system on the cabinet, the double-locked box in the basement, the name of the accountant who handled the real books. She knew, because she'd found it while cleaning behind the false panel in the mudroom, exactly which aldermen were on the payroll, which precinct captains received monthly deposits, and, most critically, she knew about the $2.3 million that Rocco had been quietly skimming from an arrangement with the Braccio family out of Milwaukee. The Braccios didn't know. If they found out, the problem would not be federal prison. The problem would be considerably more immediate and significantly more permanent. She spent the next 3 weeks doing what she always did, moving quietly through the house, being invisible, being furniture, while photographing everything she needed with a prepaid phone she'd bought with cash from a Walgreens 2 miles away. She opened a bank account in her mother's maiden name. Her mother's name before Earl was Judith Mays, and Judith Mays had a social security number that Dottie had memorized from an old tax return years ago. The account held $4,000 she'd saved from the household budget, $100 at a time for 18 months. She picked Duluth because she'd driven through it once as a kid and remembered the way Lake Superior looked like an ocean and the way nobody seemed to be in a particular hurry about anything. She bought a bus ticket with cash at Union Station. She left on the 2nd Tuesday of April. Rocco and Vance and most of the crew were in Gary, Indiana, handling a situation involving a rival pushing into their lakefront territory. The house was down to 2 guards watching the perimeter, not the inside, because who inside was a threat. And Dottie walked out the back door with a canvas bag, a flash drive, and Rocco's secondary ledger, the paper one, the physical book that lived in the safe she wasn't supposed to know about. She left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. She didn't leave a note. She didn't think one was necessary. Rocco came back from Gary at 11 in the morning. The ring was the first thing he noticed, which would surprise him later when he thought about it. Not the missing ledger, not the open safe, but the ring. Small, silver, sitting on the granite counter like a period at the end of a sentence he hadn't known was being written. He stood there for 2 full minutes before he moved. What happened next, according to Loretta's frightened texts from the back of the laundry room, was not the behavior of a rational man. He pulled the safe open and stood staring at what wasn't in it. Then he put his fist through the drywall. He called Vance, then his security chief Brock, then fired Brock on the spot, and 2 of his men walked Brock off the property in a manner that involved significant shouting and 1 broken wrist. By nightfall, he had concluded that Dottie had been taken, by a rival, by the Braccios, by someone. Because the alternative, that the quiet, overweight, forgettable housekeeper wife he'd ignored for 2 years had walked out with his most sensitive documents, was not a thing his mind was built to hold. He sent men to the Petrov organization first, then to the Valdez corridor on the west side, then to 2 associates in Bridgeport who'd been making noise for months. Nobody had her. Nobody knew who she was. Most of the men he was leaning on were genuinely confused about why it mattered. That was what started getting to him around day 4. The men he was interrogating kept asking, in various degrees of pain, the same question: who? His wife, the woman who'd managed his house for 2 years, the woman who'd sat at his dinner tables, the woman he'd told, calmly and without raising his voice, that she was furniture. Who? He sent Priya away on day 6. She showed up to comfort him, and he looked at her standing in his entryway and said, "Get out of my house," in a voice she'd never heard before, and she left without her coat. By week 2, he had stopped sleeping with any regularity. Loretta reported that he was eating less, that he'd started going into the kitchen at 3 in the morning and standing at the counter where the ring had been, that he'd told his lawyer to stall the federal timeline by any means necessary because he couldn't focus on anything else, that Vance had quietly assumed control of most operational decisions because Rocco was, and Loretta struggled with how to say this somewhere else entirely. The Braccios sent a representative to Chicago in week 3. They'd heard about the disruption. They wanted reassurance that the arrangement was stable. Rocco met with the man for 20 minutes, said very little, and afterward sat in his car in the parking garage for an hour with the engine off. He hired a man named Cutler, private intelligence, former federal, to find the trail. It took Cutler 6 weeks. 1 phone call, 2 minutes, bounced between towers in a radius around a mid-sized city on the western shore of Lake Superior. Dottie had called Loretta to make sure she was safe. She'd told herself it would be the last one. She'd believed herself. She'd been wrong. She'd been working at Fiona's lakeside diner for nearly 2 months by then. Fiona being a 62-year-old woman with arthritic knees, a talent for pie crust, and the particular warmth of someone who has been through enough to recognize when another person is rebuilding themselves and has the grace to simply hand them an apron and not ask questions. Fiona had hired Dottie on the basis of a 2-minute conversation, a firm handshake, and the fact that Dottie had correctly identified that the cherry filling needed more lemon. In 8 weeks, she hadn't asked a single question that Dottie didn't want to answer. Dottie came in at 5:30 in the morning, left at 2 in the afternoon, worked hard, and was good at it. In Duluth, her body was not a political inconvenience. It was just a body, the one that carried her up and down the kitchen floor 12 times before noon, the one that smelled like coffee and fried eggs by 7 a.m., the one she'd started buying good thick sweaters for because she was cold and she liked them. She ate what she wanted. She slept when she was tired. She had 1 shelf of paperbacks and a window that looked out at the lake, and on clear mornings she could watch the freighters moving slow and steady along the horizon. There was a man named Cal who came in for coffee and hash browns most mornings. Big guy, worked harbor maintenance, laughed at his own jokes at a volume slightly above appropriate, and didn't seem to mind that nobody else was quite as amused as he was. He'd been carefully and respectfully angling for her attention for about 3 weeks in a way that didn't alarm her, which was new and strange and worth noticing. She'd started saving his booth without being asked. He'd started bringing the paper to share without being told. She liked to read the back sections first. She was not, she told herself some evenings, happy. Not yet. But she was something quieter than sad and more durable than hope. She was okay. She was possibly becoming okay in a way she hadn't been in years. She was wiping down the counter at 7:40 on a Thursday evening, an hour after close, when the bell above the door opened. She didn't look up. "We're closed, sorry." The man who walked in brought cold air with him and something else, a quality of weight, the kind that comes from a life spent making rooms pay attention. Dottie looked up. Rocco Barretti was standing in Fiona's diner in Duluth, Minnesota, wearing a black overcoat too light for the weather, looking like a man who hadn't slept well in 6 weeks. His face was sharper than she remembered, gaunt along the jaw, hollowed under the eyes. He'd always been controlled. Now he looked like something that had been running on the wrong kind of fuel for a long time and was finally out. Through the front window she could see 2 SUVs idling across the street. "Dottie," he said. She set down her cloth. She straightened her apron. She looked at the man who had told her she was furniture, and had apparently responded to her absence by burning the Midwest. "My name is Diane," she said, "and you need to leave." He stepped further into the diner. He looked around at the Formica tables, the hand-lettered specials board, the pie case with the glass Dottie had just wiped clean, and his expression held something she'd never seen on him before. Bewilderment. 6 weeks, Dottie. I had men on every. He stopped. His jaw tightened. You did this yourself. Yes. You planned it. For 3 weeks. It wasn't complicated. She held his gaze. Nobody looked at me long enough to notice. That landed. She watched it land. The ledger, he said, is somewhere safe. The Braccios. No, nothing, Dottie said yet. Rocco moved toward the counter. He was still bigger than her, still carrying that particular gravity of a man who had never in his adult life been the one without leverage. He came to the near side of the counter and looked at her across it. Come home, he said. Whatever you want, Dottie. Just, whatever it is, I'll give it to you. You told me I was furniture, she said it quietly. No heat in it, just the fact. You told me I fill a space, that I'm not your partner, not your confidant, not anything. Do you remember saying that? Because I remember every word. I was wrong. I know you were. I want you to come home. I know. She reached under the counter and set a small flash drive on the surface between them. He stared at it like it was a lit fuse. Here's what's on a server in a city I'm not going to tell you about. Photographs of your secondary ledger, 6 years of coded entries, the payment correspondence with 4 aldermen and 2 precinct captains, and the Braccio discrepancy, 2.3 million, 3 years. Line items I photographed from the folder in your mudroom panel while I was cleaning the baseboards. She paused. It's indexed, it's clean, and it's scheduled to deliver automatically every Friday at noon, unless I personally log in and reset the timer. The room was very quiet. Where does it go? He said. His voice had gone flat, the way voices go when the body is redirecting all available resources to damage assessment. The FBI field office in Chicago, 2 investigative journalists, and the Braccio family's private correspondence email, which I found in your desk in the folder you labeled insurance, which I thought showed a certain lack of imagination. She looked at him steadily. You can take that drive. It has the decryption key for your accounts, enough to get ahead of the Braccio situation, stabilize the financial exposure, buy yourself time with the feds. I'm not trying to destroy you, Rocco. I never was. I just needed to make sure you had no reason to come after me. And if I take it, he said slowly, and send Cutler back here in a month. Then on a Friday at noon, a lot of people learn a lot of things at the same time. She tilted her head. You know I'm not bluffing. You know that because you know what kind of person builds a thing like this from inside a house where nobody thought to watch her. Furniture, Rocco. You said it yourself. Behind him, through the window, one of the SUVs edged forward slightly in the cold, then stopped. Rocco Barretti, who had sat across from federal prosecutors and given them nothing, who had managed $400 million of business across the South Side for 15 years, who had made men considerably more dangerous than anyone in this diner, feel the specific weight of his attention, slowly lowered himself to his knees on the black and white tile floor. It didn't look theatrical. It looked like something structural giving way. I'm sorry. His voice came out rough and unvarnished. I looked for you for 6 weeks and I didn't sleep and I walked through your room at 3 in the morning and I couldn't. He stopped, started again. I didn't know what I had. I know that's not something you owe me credit for. I know it doesn't change anything I said, but I am genuinely sorry, Dottie. I mean that. She looked down at him. A part of her, the part that had sat across from him in his kitchen at midnight, and thought maybe that had once pressed her palms into a burgundy dress and stood in the mirror and let herself feel something like hope, That part of her wanted very badly to reach down and touch his hair. She recognized her. She didn't dismiss her. But that woman had stood in a study and been told she was furniture, and had waited 2 years for that same man to notice she was alive. And she'd been right there the entire time, right in front of him, visible and present, and asking for nothing extraordinary, and what she'd gotten was a word, furniture. She'd needed 400 miles and 8 weeks and flour on her collar, and Cal showing up every morning with the newspaper to understand the difference between being needed and being seen. "I know you mean it," Dottie said. "I believe you." She pushed the flash drive across the counter toward him. "Take it. Go back to Chicago. Fix what you broke. Handle the Braccios. Do whatever you do." She kept her voice level. "The timer stays active. Every Friday I log in, and the world keeps moving normally. If your people come near Duluth, it doesn't. If anything happens to my father, anything, Rocco, it doesn't." She paused. "And if I slip on ice, or get in a car accident, or get sick, that's a problem too. So it is in your direct personal interest to hope that I live a very long, very peaceful life up here." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite the opposite. He picked up the flash drive. His hand was not entirely steady. "If I changed," he said quietly. "If I actually—" "There isn't a road back from this one," Dottie said. "Not with anger. Just with the kind of certainty that doesn't need to defend itself. Not because I hate you. I don't. But because I'm okay here, Rocco. I'm actually okay for the first time in years, and it has nothing to do with you or what you think of me or whether you've decided I matter now that I'm gone." She picked up her cleaning cloth. "That's not something I'm willing to trade." He stayed on his knees for another long moment, the way a person stays in a place they know they're leaving for the last time. Then he stood, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who isn't fully sure of his legs, and he buttoned his coat and he looked at her once more, the way you look at a thing you know you're not going to see again. And he walked out into the cold. The SUVs pulled away from the curb. The diner was quiet. Dottie stood at her counter with both palms flat on the formica, listening to the wind off the lake work at the windows. The pie case hummed. The overhead light buzzed its usual low note. Outside, the street was empty and white. Then she picked up her cloth and turned back to the glass and finished what she'd started. She was 26 years old. She weighed 280 pounds. She had flour on her collar that morning, and her feet ached. And there was a shelf of paperbacks waiting for her at home, and Cal had left a note under his coffee cup that said, "Save my booth tomorrow," and she was going to. And somewhere in the dark, a man was driving back toward a city and a life that she'd already decided he could keep. She was here. She was warm. She was the most dangerous person in the room, and the room was hers.